I'm going to discuss a conversation between Bloom as a more established writer whose position was questioned during the culture wars, which began in the 1990s, and at the time, the up-and-coming new discourses represented by authors such as Gilbert&Gubar and Gates. So in Bloom's Elegy and Nostalgia for a Time Lost, Elegiac Conclusion, which was published in 1994, he writes, "Greatness in the West's literature centers upon Shakespeare, who has become the touchstone for all who come before and after him," on page 230. In Gates' Canon Formation, Literary History, and the Afro-American Tradition, published in the 1990s, he is precisely arguing against this notion of the tragic lure of white power, the lure of accepting white critical theory as universal, seen on page 178. Gilbert&Gubar in The Female Swerve, published in 1979, similarly does the same thing. And so there's a sort of conversation that is happening here with two sides that I will examine and discuss in this video. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bloom's School of Resentment, which carries the weight of his projection of the blame of America's demise, as he attributes America's addiction to civil and domestic violence and its crisis in literary study, referring to Chaucer, Shakespeare, Milton, and so on, being replaced by Batman, comic strips, television, movies, and theme parks, replaced by the specifically listed out School of Resentment. Feminists, Marxists, Lacanians, New Historicists, Deconstructionists, and Semi-Utopians, on page 232. Gilbert&Gubar fit in here under the feminist category, I would say, or at least Bloom would put them under here, and Gate would maybe fit in here under the New Historicist, perhaps a Deconstructionist. Nevertheless, Bloom would see them as part of the resenters that have a political goal, weakening the aesthetic power that he deemed so represented by Shakespeare and the so-called dead white European males, which he so values, some of which he also attributes to Dante, Milton, Joyce, Kafka, and so on. Elegiac Conclusion may be seen as a lament for the past, the way things were, but it can also be seen as Eurocentric, anti-multiculturalist, exclusive, elitist, oblivious to white privilege, and part of the hindering of literary progression, of human expression and expansion of literature to include all social groups, to resist the historically canonical way of literature, to see the complicated political implications underlying the ways that the canon is shaped. Throughout Elegiac Conclusion, there's a kind of lack of acknowledgement that there is a political and social mechanism as to how the canon is a social consensus. Although Bloom is referring to the culture wars, he seems to not understand fully the implications of it, and he is against it. I'm going to look at how Gilbert&Gubar, as well as Gates, would respond to Bloom's Elegiac Conclusion. Although Bloom at the time was a more established author, his position was threatened by these younger and upcoming discourses, who were also established, but they were more marginalized at the time, hence their arguments, and there is a kind of a power struggle at play. Gates speaks to this as he writes, "Western economic and political subjugation has inflicted upon us a desire to imitate, to please, to refashion our public discursive images of our black selves after that of the colonizer." So here, in a primarily white-dominated patriarchal society, which is also reflected in literature, patriarchally white literature, he argues that we should turn away from the old white man, the canon, which represents black people as voiceless, invisible, unrepresented, unrepresentable, and not to go towards the Cambridge and to fashion your tools after the white master. He proposes a redefining of theory from our own black cultures to explore the black universe on page 178, the pale shadow of the white master's critical discourse. He looks at the two previous black anthologies and criticizes both of them. The first one, Lanus's, he argues, follows the logic that we are like the French, so treat us like the French. And the second one, Allen's, kind of follows the logic of highlighting blacks' achievements, so kind of saying like we are geniuses too. He argues that rather than kind of be embarrassed of the black aesthetic in literature to call for a third revolutionary way, a new anthology that is deeply self-aware and representative of the black aesthetic. Similarly, female writers have had difficulty responding and reacting to a primarily patriarchal society, something that Bloom is unaware of in his writing. He is only aware of his position being threatened by what he thinks is just a political stanza. Gilbert and Gubar talk about female writers participating and using, and they refer to Harold Bloom's key terms, swerving from the central sequences of male literary history. And they define swerved as when a younger writer rejects the older poet's text as a way of creating a newer version of it, when strong poets misread their predecessors as a way of making space for themselves. And so work produced by 19th century women were often seen as an oddity or eccentric, because it's an attempt to transcend their own anxiety by revising male genres. They compare the kind of dominant group of male-female relationships to the black similarity, the black parallel, and the master-slave relationship. And so female writers, they argue, in an attempt to free themselves, shatter the mirror that has so long reflected what every woman was supposed to be. Women writers in England and America throughout the 19th century and onto the 20th century have been obsessed with deconstructing and reconstructing images of women inherited from male literature. But in doing so, obsessively create characters who enact their own covert authorial anger. On page 293. In this sense, the poet then speaks for the mirrored mad woman in the poem. This mad woman emerges over and over again in 19th century literature as women writers obsessively create fierce independent characters who seek to destroy all the patriarchal structures, which both their authors and their author's submissive heroines seem to accept as inevitable. An example of this is Bertha Mason from Jane Eyre, showing the not yet other human. There's an excerpt of this in Spivak on page 247. A figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not tell. It groveled seemingly on all fours. It snatched and growled like some strange wild animal. But it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark, grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its hair and face. Jane Eyre was published in 1847, thus deeming Bronte part of the 19th century women writers Gilbert and Gubar were showing that were struggling to respond to a primarily patriarchal society and patriarchal literature. So going back to the conversation between Bloom and these up-and-coming new discourses and marginalized writers trying to come into the canon, Bloom doesn't seem to really acknowledge or see the effect of patriarchy in the canon on women and people of color. Rather, he states an overly simplistic argument on page 228. Either they were aesthetic values or they're only the overdeterminations of race, class, gender. You must choose. For if you believe that all value ascribed to poems or plays or novels and stories is only a mystification in the service of the ruling class, then why should you read at all, rather than go forth to serve the desperate needs of the exploited classes? Here, he seems to be acknowledging a certain political and social consensus to the canon, but he once again attributes it to something that is natural. He attributes Shakespeare's positionality, the author function, to his universalism, something he claims has been felt to be more natural than anyone else's mirroring of reality ever since the plays were first staged, on page 229. His centering of Shakespeare in Western literature is precisely what writers such as Gilbert and Gubar and Gates and other marginalized discourses attempt to debunk. He seems to realize that he was losing. He says that Matisse, the French painter and sculptor, as well as Stravinsky, Russian composer, can go down with Joyce and Proust as four more dead white European males, on page 232. Although today it may seem as though we have won for a more multicultural education, perhaps the problem has just merely morphed and evolved. Has the non-STEM disciplines become disciplines that won't pay off, and we won't get a return on our investments? Teaching used to be a highly regarded discipline as male, but today it is a more female regarded position, and it is also a less regarded position in society. Now that the resentors have come in and crashed Bloom's gates, has the teaching become Have the Bloomians just become more devalued now that the resenters have won?